Hi everyone, here we are with the Assessment 2 overview for you to support your understandings of Assessment 2 and to ultimately have great success in the unit. So as always, the recording and thinking of your assessment has this 5-circle support network. I've talked about this a few times, but just so you're clear, we start with this overview where you can go back and look at the recording, so you're really clear about what the assessment is about. Make sure you look at the assessment overview. Lots of the questions that you're looking for will be available on this overview. And then the workshops and tutorials provide you with lots of helpful information. In week 6, for example, we talk a lot about policy, which is, challenging. And in week 6, you'll get an opportunity to work in your tutorial with your tutor, and you can bring your article along with you. So that will be really helpful. And then the discussion board, which many of you already know how to use and are using really effectively, can be a really helpful tool. So these are the 5 circles of support that I wrap around in this unit so that you ultimately are clear about what you're doing and have success in the unit. So the aim of this assessment is for pre-service teachers, that's what you are, to demonstrate your knowledge and understanding of some of the diverse issues facing children and families and how that links to policy and practice and contemporary communities. It's asking you to once more complete a portfolio that's based on the learning modules 4 to 6. And it requires you to think about 3 key issues presented in the unit content, or 3 key topics with 500 word responses for each. Just a reminder, you can go over slightly on the word count. So if you end up being around 2,000 minus your references, then that's fine. We did have an assignment in assessment 1 that was 5,000, and that is much too long. You'd be penalised for that. So keeping within a short range of going over, say, 500 words is reasonable. We also had a number of students who submitted who were under 1,000, and that usually means you haven't add enough discussion and detail to the assessment. So being really under or really over are both problematic. Make sure you include evidence from the readings to support your suggestions and claims and illustrate how they apply to teachers in education settings. Just quickly again, a reminder, a portfolio is not an essay. It's a short snippet of information around 3 topics where you're reporting information about your article that you discover, the newsletter you create, and how they link to policies and practices. So just a reminder, even though it's not an essay, it still needs to use English expression in an effective way, professional writing, punctuation, grammar, and academic references. Make sure you use APA referencing. I think most of you now know that. Your reference list should be on a separate page, not under each of the 3 topics. Use clear headings for the topics. You can also use subheadings if you want to make your work really clear. And you can use dot points. But it's very important to know the difference between dot points and paragraphs. Some people have written their whole portfolio with dot points, and that's a not effective way to write in academia because you're not adding enough detail. So a combination of some dot points when you're listing things and then the paragraphs when you need more depth and detail. For your newsletter, you can use tables, diagrams, fancy headings. I'll show you some of that in a moment, but you do not have to. Just a reminder, your presentation, your portfolio is not being marked on your presentation. It's being marked on family communication. Some people really like to do that, and I'll show you an example, but it sets the kind of creative juices flowing, but you certainly don't have to. A 12-point font is helpful and a 1.5 line spacing, so markers can put comments specifically where that might relate to a particular issue. Include the Southern Cross cover page and complete all the sections, including the AI acknowledgement and your special consideration due date and approval if you have one. The headings and references are, as you know, not included in the word count, and you can submit your assessment as a PDF or a Word document. If, for example, you are using Canva, or even if you're using Word to create your newsletter and you've got lovely headings and you've got some images and you've got text in there that is in a newsletter style, it is better to save your Word document as a PDF, because then things don't move around as you upload it to the Turnitin system. But you can choose. Okay, so as you know, in a university course, we expect you to demonstrate a level of self-awareness, critical thinking, and the ability to work independently. I completely understand that a lot of the students in the Graduate Diploma of Early Childhood have recently come to Australia, and you're still grappling with the cultural expectations of what it is to live here, but also to study here. So it's important that you're aware that there's a huge level of responsibility we expect from you. One of the ways that expectations comes clear in your assessments are there no resubmissions. So, make sure your assessment is going to pass. I know that's hard for you to get your head around, but look at the unit learning outcomes. Make sure you are given every opportunity to think through how this assessment can be successful, because there are no resubmissions. And ways to do that is to constantly engage with the unit content, attend the workshops and tutorials, and practice and play with the ideas. I know in the workshops that I complete, the questions that you ask really spur other people to ask questions and spur me to respond to them. And that's a really engaging way of communicating together. As independent learners, we don't have time to read over your drafts, and there's always an expectation in Australian universities that this is your job. We don't give individual feedback, although you might get some of that in your tutorials. You can't, for example, email a copy of your assignment for it to be checked. I know that would be helpful for you in completing your assessment, but it's not necessarily helpful in your learning. These are the things that you need to grapple with as you're completing your assessment. And some of the most challenging assessments have the deepest learning. I know some of the most challenging things that I've done with learning, I've wanted to, throw something at the wall because it's been so frustrating and I can't quite get it. But when you do, that's deep learning, and that's what university learning is supposed to be about. Use TIL paragraphs if you're trying to work out ways to structure paragraphs. That would be helpful. You can use Grammarly. You're allowed to do that in our units, and that's another helpful way to structure your writing. Some of you are already making connections with students on the discussion boards, so that's helpful too. All right, let's just do this quickly and then I'll break it down with more detail. Your submission is really assessing you against the following criteria. The first is that you're going to do a critical text analysis of a media article, newspaper, social media article, or something you find on the internet, focusing on an early childhood issue. You then, from that topic that you've reported on, analysed, create a newsletter article for families and a wider community. So you've really got to make sure that the communication you're using and even the topic that you've chosen aligns with being able to communicate that to families. And I'll give you an example of that in a moment. You are going to use citations and evidence from literature to substantiate the claims you made. You might refer back to the article. In fact, I think you should do that. But you will also use the unit readings to support understandings. Remember, this newsletter article is doing two things. It's a communication tool for families, but it's also your assessment. So make sure that You include academic referencing in exactly the same way that you do to all assessments. You then link the article and the newsletter article to policies and practices. What does that look like in relation to Australian government policies? What does that look like in relation to the policies that are in an education setting? You, of course, don't have to list or include all policies. You've only got 500 words. You've only really got one topic. But use examples and show the links between your topic and how that could relate to policy. Again, I'll show you an example in the next slide. And the fourth area is academic literacy, where you're looking at your English expression, your writing, your referencing, and how you've used the unit readings. So the first critical thing to do is choose an article in this assessment, and I've noticed that students tend to choose articles that might be overly negative or highly complex or for older children, or sometimes articles about really big complex issues like child abuse. So the first thing you need to make sure when you're choosing your article is for children and families in early childhood. Early childhood is classified as the years from birth to 8 years of age, but you might even want to stick from birth to 5 years of age. So choose an article that is really relevant to them. And I want to draw your attention to the Early Years Learning Framework, which is summarised here in this slide. You've probably seen this before in principles and practices, but I want to show you how useful this can be in choosing your article. So the first thing about the Early Years Learning Framework is it has 5 learning outcomes. Now look at these. You could choose an article about children's identity that aligns very strongly with what we've talked about in the unit. Cultural identity, gender identity, children learning who they are in a really positive way. We've learnt about First Nations children and their identity. So you could find an article about young children that relates to identity. You could clearly write about that in your newsletter. It aligns very much with the policy here that you can also relate it to, and you could align that to education setting policies. What is the policy in an early childhood setting say about gender equity or cultural equity or cultural inclusion? And then all the other examples here of those learning outcomes are really helpful too. Children are connected and contribute to their world. This could be an article about social justice or sustainability, children learning about environments, children learning about nature and being in nature, children having connections with their communities in all sorts of ways. So again, you could choose an article about that. It already links to the policy of the Early Years Learning Framework. It's not a huge heavy topic. You can write about that in your family newsletter. If you chose, say, an issue like child abuse, really important topic, aligns to social justice, but it's a heavy topic. You've never written a newsletter for families before. I think that's not something I would even put in a newsletter. I would write a policy about that and I would communicate that to families in different ways. So think about some of those topics that are really difficult to communicate in a short little newsletter that's often more about engaging families with what they can do with their children or what is happening in the education setting. It's not usually a big heavy topic. You could still write in there about climate change. I know that's a big topic, or children experiencing warm weather, for example. But when you're choosing your topic, the most important thing is to think about how it aligns with your newsletter, because some topics are really going to be challenging to write about. Some shouldn't even be in a newsletter because they're very confronting topics. Child abuse, family violence would be 2 examples of that. Children have a strong sense of well-being. Well, you could definitely choose all sorts of information about health and well-being in your article. Children are confident and involved learners. You could definitely write about children's learning, children's development. There's be plenty of articles you could find about that, and about children as effective communicators. Now, because so many of you are bilingual and many of you come from countries other than Australia, you already have a really good understanding about communication. You speak 2, 3, 4, 5 languages. So finding articles about bilingualism, about cultural diversity, and putting that in your newsletter would be really helpful. For example, families who often migrate to Australia, or even second generation migration families, often struggle with knowing whether they should speak in English or in their first or second language with children. And research shows that it's really helpful if children grow up in bilingual or trilingual households, because they're learning all sorts of aspects of language. So children in these situations sometimes take a little longer to learn their languages, but they are learning 2 or 3 at the same time. And it's incredibly important for children to have their home languages as part of their first language, so that they keep those connections with culture, because of course language is a huge link to culture. That's something you know about. That's something you could easily write about. So that's the learning outcomes. And then if we look at the practices, again, they all connect. Interconnected approaches, play-based learning. Now that's another topic that families who don't come from Western countries often struggle with. They're not common in countries like India or China, Nepal, Bhutan. You would know that. So when you come here and we talk about play-based pedagogy and learning, some of you might think, I don't really know what that is. I don't see how it's valuable. So these are the things that you can include in your newsletter. You can choose an article that aligns with that, and then write some interesting aspects for families that would be helpful for them to understand. And you can see some of those topics in the principles that align with the learning outcomes and the practices: diversity, family partnerships, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspectives, equity, inclusion, sustainability. Great topics to choose from, because they all align beautifully with the Early Years Learning Framework. And that means you can link it straight away to that policy, and usually policies that are in education settings as well. So I hope that's helpful, to spend a bit of time thinking that yes, you can choose an article that's a broader topic, but if you're struggling with this, I would stick to the things that are in the Early Years Learning Framework. You know that's going to set you in the right direction. Okay, so you're going to complete a critical text analysis, and that means you find your article. There's some suggestions here. You include the chosen link to that article, and you pay attention to ideas around what childhood is, what family and community diversity is. You do not have to cover all of them though. So long as your area is focused on early childhood and about families and communities, one of those, you don't have to do all of them, that will be helpful. You write a summary of your article. You do a critical analysis where you look at the strengths and challenges, what's missed, what did you notice about it, and evaluate why the topic is important. So that's your first topic. And there was an amazing question on the discussion board about this that I think is really helpful, and I'm going to repeat it. So the person suggested that they've gone to the student learning zone to learn about what critical analysis, which is great, and they wanted to follow the instructions. So there's a nice hint if you're not sure about critical analysis. That's a great thing to Google. You know, that's a great thing to even use for AI as part of the prep for your assessment, or go to the learning zone to help you. And they said, is critical analysis about analysing the article and comparing the relevant course readings and academic literature? Because that's what critical analysis is. Yes. And how is that article relevant to families and then how is that part of evaluation. So I've responded to that by saying, yes, you're analysing the article, looking for key ideas, gaps, strengths and challenges in what's been written. You're then going to align that to the unit readings, because as that person said, that's what critical analysis is. You can even include some of your own examples if you like, but always back that up with supporting literature. And yes, then the family newsletter reports on that in a family-friendly way. That's why the choice of article is so important. And then you link that to policies. And Module 6 has got lots of helpful information about policies from a global perspective, from an Australian perspective, and from an education setting perspective. So go back and look at the workshop and tutorial and content for Module 6. So thank you for that amazing question. And as I said, is it relevant? What does the article say? How does it link to family? Why does it matter? And what works or doesn't work in the article? So that's topic 1. And then topic 2 is your family newsletter, outlining the ideas that you explored. And I think I've mentioned these things already. You don't have to use a newsletter style, but you can. But make sure it's written in everyday English. It's not written like an essay. It's friendly and warm and informative, and not preachy. Like, you don't want to say you should be doing this. It's really trying to engage families in your topic and just give them some information that they might not have previously been aware of. It's also not about giving your opinion or recommendations. You could use an example, but it's not really opinion-based. It's more reporting on what the article has said in a family-friendly way. And some tips for writing your newsletter, and you can see an example here on the right of the screen that was created in Canva. Sorry, my big head is in the way, but you can see there's an image there with a quote that works incredibly well. There's very small paragraphs of text. You don't want long essay type paragraphs. Another clear heading, let your children play, and then again more images of children playing. So start with a strong heading. Come up with a catchy title for your newsletter, a bit like what we might call clickbait on the internet, something that's going to invite people to read it. Include a clear call to action. This is a way of saying this topic is really important, or this topic is interesting, or this topic might be something that you find useful because. So it's a call to action. Include hyperlinks and in-text citations to research. And you'll be writing this from the perspective of a teacher in an early childhood education setting. And some people on the discussion board have said, oh, can I make up my own education setting and pretend I'm the teacher? And I said, of course, because this sometimes puts your head in the right direction of how you're writing this. Offer examples that make the topic clearer for families. Keep it really clear and to the point, and break up heavy text with lists or bullets. Include images and quotes, and use a template if you want to. The one I've just shown you is from Canva. Again, a reminder, that's what a newsletter style is like, but you can write it just in normal text. You don't have to include all these features, but it's still helpful for you as a teacher to know how to write a newsletter. And some people love writing that way. The impact of educational policies and practices is topic number 3. Now you use the same issue and the understandings you've developed in your newsletter to align that with early childhood policy and practice. How might some of the ideas be reflected in policy and practices? So let's go back to some of those articles, some of those ideas that we thought about for possible articles. So if you're writing about children's language and bilingualism, and that's your article, you've written a newsletter idea, and you've maybe even made some suggestions to families about what they could do in the home, not preachy, gentle. And then you might say how that looks like in the practices of the early childhood setting, what policies that aligns with. So it might align with an educational policy. You might even have a specific language development or cultural learning policy. And in the practices, it might be that you have bilingual teachers. It might be that you have books that are written in multiple languages, or that children are even learning different languages for greetings. You might even have a sign at the beginning of your setting that says hello in 10 different languages. There's so many things that you could do to promote that notion of bilingualism or trilingualism, where children are learning to play with lots of different languages. So give examples of what that could look like, and how might an education setting develop partnerships with families to help improve that topic of bilingualism, or to communicate that. You know, again, if you've got a family who arrives at the education setting, they haven't been in the country very long, their English might not be good. It's often very good, but it might not be. So how could you help them? How could you help with integrating the family and the children? And here's an example from the Avenue Children's Centre of an inclusion and equity policy. So these are some of the things that you could consider when you're integrating that. And every topic that you've chosen, every article you've chosen that you've written about for your newsletter, you can link it to policy. I know many of you are not clear about education, early childhood education. You haven't worked in it. Some of you haven't even done a placement yet. But this is something you could research. It's something you could even think about, you know, with aligning with your topic, because it would make sense that if you were writing about play, that there could be a policy about play. And you could link that to the Early Years Learning Framework. So the impact of educational policies are that things like you promote diversity through practices of having cultural diversity in the dolls, children learning about their identity, children drawing pictures about their families. These are all examples we've used in the unit that link practices to the things that are happening with articles around families, communities, and children, which is what, of course, this unit is all about. So family diversity is part of the everyday curriculum. It's not just a token event. It's not just doing NAIDOC week or a Chinese New Year. So, you know, think about how you include that in your newsletter, if that was your article, for example. All right, a quick finishing with some of the technical aspects of the assessment. I think by now you're all clear about academic integrity. We had a few assessments in assessment 1 where people had breached that, either knowingly or unknowingly, where they used AI more than in the planning stages. So just remember that in this unit, you're using it for planning, you're not using it for the writing. We had a couple of examples where people had their similarity reading and Turnitin was very high because they'd taken a lot of information, cut and pasted it from the internet, not referenced it, even cut and pasted it from other students' work. So we can see all those things, and it's helpful for you to make sure you reference and write things in a way that aligns with the academic integrity. Some tension points for the assessment is, I think I've gone through some of these already, but let's just be clear. The choice of article doesn't align with the family newsletter. Not giving yourself enough time. I noticed, some people have already submitted their assessments and they haven't had this kind of information. So give yourself enough time to let your assignment breathe, to give it time to percolate the ideas, particularly with critical analysis. That's deeper thinking. So, give yourself enough time. Don't rush with it. Don't do it on a weekend and think you'll get it done. Make sure it's written in a clear way. Subheadings, headings, clear paragraphs, so that the The text is easy to read, particularly your newsletter. I've talked about paragraphs already. Using teal paragraph method is helpful. So if you know, have a look at the slide that I included about that, I think in the workshop 5. APA referencing I've talked about. Make sure you include at least 10 references. Most of you did that for assessment 1, but some people didn't include the learning materials. So please make sure you read them, quote from them, reference them, and that will be a really helpful way of you building that academic writing skill. Sometimes there was not enough discussion about the 3 topics, and sometimes there was too much. So you've got to kind of really balance that. I know you don't have many words, and I've really instructed the markers to be very clear with assessment 2 that this is not essays. You couldn't possibly include everything you want to about these topics. So you've got to kind of really pitch it that it's not too much and not too little. And as I said before, too much Google or AI information, it doesn't send you in the right direction, and there's a chance that you're plagiarising, so be really careful about that. Referencing. APA referencing is required, as I said. Some people didn't create a reference list on a new page, so do that. Some people put their references at the end of the 3 topics. So really helpful if you make sure that your reference list is always at the end. If you're referencing images that you've used in your newsletter, add them to the reference list, but just add them after your references. Just do a heading, image references, and you can include the name of the image if you can find it, and the link if you found it online. Go and have a look at how APA does that. APA referencing is listed in alphabetical order. There are no numbers or dot points. That should say points, not paints. And make sure you indent the second and subsequent line in the reference list. Most of you did this really well. Broader literature such as textbooks, research books, peer-reviewed articles, they can be sourced from the library. Just use the data search tool. So, say for example, you thought, I'm not happy with my article that I've found. I'm listening to what I've said in here. I want to find an article about bilingualism. Well, instead of Googling that, go to the library, the Southern Cross Library, and put that in the data search, and you'll end up with an article. That would be really helpful for you to use. And include the units as a first priority. Okay, everybody, I hope that is helpful for you. I wish you every success for the second assignment and overall success in the unit. Just a reminder, if you didn't do so well in your first assignment, let's say you got 20, then it means you would need to get 30 in the second assignment to pass. You need an overall pass out of 50 out of 100. So if you didn't pass the first assignment, please make sure you give a lot of time and energy and thought to the second one so you can pass the unit with flying colours, because a reminder, there's no resubmissions, and you'll be really happy with yourself that you've done that. We wish you all the best for the holidays. If some of you are leaving early, from Tracy, myself and T has done an incredible job in the unit with the discussion board, and I'm sure she will be really happy to make sure you succeed as well. Thank you so much, everyone. All the best.